reën val neer op doringdraad. Die reën val neer op berge. Die reën val op valleie. Die reën word strome. Die reën word riviere. Die reën word 'n see. Kom aan reën.
I would say that, people are trying very hard to put the past behind them, to put the past behind them and forget it and try and get on with their normal lives again. Pick up the different pieces of their shattered lives and build. Sometimes I think of these things, and become very, very agitated, feel like exploding. So in a way, you do have a community, consisting of walking time bombs. People who could explode at any time, who've got these pent-up emotions inside that are dying to manifest themselves. So one hopes that, these things would gradually, get out of one's mind, I'm not so sure if I'm not deluding myself, by reasoning along those lines, but what else can one do?
Johannesburg, 1994. Angela and I have returned to the new South Africa to remember the old one, to remember the days of apartheid, and to record the experiences of some of the people who fought in the underground for this new South Africa. The bleak days of repression, the time when resistance had waned, the 60s and early 70s, the time recalled by the South African writer Njabula Ndebele in a text he wrote at the beginning of the 90s after his return from exile. One of my most abiding memories of the old South Africa is the memory of what distance and time really meant when traveling. That distance was something to endure, in constant fear of being stopped and questioned on one's right to exist. No journey was ever made with the certainty of reaching one's destination. Nothing existed between the beginning and end of the journey but mental and emotional trauma. Soweto, 1976, the uprising of black youth. Hector Peterson, the first child shot dead. A time of victims, of never-ending funerals. That was the time when I first came to South Africa, charged as a journalist with recording the voices of long-muzzled resistance. The time when I walked stunned through a Soweto scarred by unrest, and I tried to understand what I saw. For Angela, a South African, it was different. It was her country, her roots were there. And she'd long been a link between the South African opposition and the solidarity scene in Germany. On the 16th of June, police fired on a peaceful demonstration of school children. After 3 days, hundreds lay dead on Soweto streets. This was the turning point.
It's not an easy thing to leave your country, to leave your friends, family, and venture into the unknown.
I just wanted to go, get my training, and come back afterwards.
It became clear to me that the only language they understood was the language of force.
The time has come to face these people.
Thousands of young people quietly left the country. All were driven by the same thought.
We shall return, definitely. We shall return.
They came back a few years later, by night and fog, crossing the border illegally, equipped with guerrilla training, false names and forged passports, with new identities, a new life story, concealed in a net of legends, as it was called in the underground code. Legends as camouflage, behind which they, as individuals, disappeared. Kevin Koboshiane. It is also his story we are telling. He was just 16, still a schoolboy, as he first set out to cross the border for Swaziland. That's a good 25 years ago now.
It is only now that I realize what a normal life would have been for me at that time. I never had that. And I think I wouldn't be bitter. But if given a choice, I think I would have loved to have gone through that.
Jenny Cargill, we shall also tell her story. As Kevin made his way to the Swaziland border, she was sitting in the lecture halls of Durban University studying business science. When Biko died and her fellow students organized demonstrations, she was in the middle of preparing for her exams, which she passed with honors. Like Kevin, she declined all ostentatious gestures and steered clear of student protest activities.
I think I felt as a white I had no place in South Africa when I was about 16, 17. And that the best thing to do is if you're a white and you couldn't challenge the system, it was to leave.
She was 24 years old, had travelled in Europe, and was working for South Africa's leading business paper when I first met her in 1978. And almost immediately we became friends. 3 years later, she and her husband, Howard Barrell, moved to Zimbabwe, where he was to work as a correspondent in Harare. I got a few letters and postcards, but they always sounded a bit restrained, as if Jenny were disappointed in Harare. Then suddenly she returned. She went back to working as a journalist in Johannesburg as before. She was unchanged. I didn't notice anything. We interviewed people, worked on the tape, sat in the garden listening to music. Nothing had changed. But everything had changed. What I didn't know, Jenny was working underground for the ANC. Her apparently normal life was just camouflage for her secret.
In the early hours of the morning, sometimes 6 in the morning, I would take my bag and my swimming costume and then walk through the bush. And I have memories of that being very silent, very quiet, at times a mist hanging over. So in a sense that was a loneliness, but it was one that I wanted to live with. And in a sense the underground memories connect with that. I obviously lived an elite upbringing. My father was the general manager of the village we lived in, later a director of a major corporation. So from that perspective, we lived a very elite lifestyle. I think everything was generally available. Large house, very many servants working on the property, a clear divide between who the servants were and who we were, from the point of view that all servants would be black and we would be white. So one was very aware of those differences. There were hostel dwellers living right in the village, and we had access into those hostels as children, so we were running in and out. I always remember just a distance. They would look at us, they would watch us. We went onto their territory. Of course, they could never come anywhere near our territory. Their conditions were appalling. I just felt, I remember all the time as a child that I would look at someone who was black and let's say someone was being abusive to them, or they needed money and looked really unhappy and sorrowful. I could never cope with that. I always just felt dreadful when I saw that. Always wanted to go in and try and do something to make that right. And I often felt that that was a big motivator for me getting involved in the ANC.
I don't think I ever was interested in white people. They were very distant from me. I spent most of the time in the township where there were no white people. See, my mother left me to get married when I was still very, very young. So I was left in the care of my grandparents. That was a very homely type of a situation where you had brothers, where you had sisters, where you had uncles. There was always something happening in that house. There would be singing, the chatting, rating of old stories. You'd be listening. So I would have been the blue-eyed boy of the family at that particular moment. I went to school, I passed very well. I did my work at home, I never got into any problems, etc. So basically I was a very good boy. I didn't have any form of political interest. There are a number of things that are thrown at you that make you aware of the situation. Not in a very conscious way. I mean, the most basic one would be that a white man is superior. Now, in that house at home where I grew up, there was no bathroom. I'd never seen a bath ever in my life. But where my aunt used to work, they had bath shower area where I would fill a whole bathtub and jump in there and spend as much time as I wanted. But you do it as you're stealing something. And you learn to keep to your place.
I think one of the overriding feelings that I had when I was in the 70s and 80s was a complete alienation from your white community, that you just didn't agree with them. But I couldn't identify with the student activists. So much of it was sort of platform politics. So I only, in fact, got politically involved once I started journalism. And then I felt happy with that engagement. It was through my professionalism as a journalist that I felt that I could do something. I could write about issues. I could expose them.
I remember one incident where we were actually arrested at Jenny's house. That was funny.
Joe Tloloe, journalist, at that time a colleague of Jenny's at the Sunday Post.
We went for a Christmas party at her house while we were on strike. Her neighbors were unhappy with so many blacks going into that house, and they phoned the police. And the police came and they took everybody to Newlands police station.
But again, both went off to different places. When I went home, I went in one direction. When they went home, they went in the opposite direction. 60 Becker Street. That was a little bit like a little enclave that was separate from your normal white society.
Becker Street was this little oasis of joy and fun.
Howard Barrell, journalist, at that time married to Jenny.
In a very vulnerable place. It's where I met my first wife. I fell in love.
That was, in a sense, our sanctuary, away from the sort of horrendous side of apartheid. It felt like it.
And I always felt that it was like a magic garden, and these kind of military bulldozers were going to come in at some point. Well, they never did, but it was a place under threat. It was almost like a place of childhood under threat.
I was working for Drum magazine when we got this phone call saying that children are being shot in Soweto. I remember dropping the phone and walking away to go and cry, essentially. And I didn't understand how humans could do this to other human beings.
There was some kind of a shift towards horrible aggression on our part. I would think that there was a serious change in my attitude towards white because I discovered for the first time that they could die. I discovered for the first time that they are not that superior. I discovered for the first time that we do have something in us that could make them run. And that's when you saw the expression in the African people throwing off a fist in the air, which is a much more emotional demonstration of the strength in you. And you also feel that I am human at last.
For me, if I think back to the 1970s, particularly after 1976 uprising, the feeling is one of fear. I think I was, like many people, kind of desperately seized with how do we move forward? I mean, how do we make things change? People were getting arrested, people were getting detained.
Every time there are footsteps in the yard at night, I suspect it's the police coming. 1977, they again came to collect me. They took me to Alexander Street Police Station. Now, it's a police station in a very isolated part of Pietermaritzburg. So you can scream your head off, nobody will hear you.
It was 7:45.
Sam Poloto, trade union leader, underground in the same unit as Jenny.
I went into the torture chamber at Compol on Monday, 7:45, and I went out there on Thursday at I think it was 5:15. Just count the hours. No sleep, no rest. All the time standing or blindfolded. All these days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, until in the afternoon.
And then cover you with a blanket, and then they would use electrodes on your back here. And then you would scream and scream and scream because of the electric shocks at the back of your neck here. And then after a while, they would remove the blanket and say, "Why are you screaming? What is there? There's nothing here. Just seeing ghosts, that's all. Did the ghosts come visiting you under the blanket?" And then after a while, they would do exactly the same thing again.
You know, after going through such a very cruel, action, it come to our mind that, it was better if you were dead than alive, I'm not speaking about maybe going to jail, no. You feel yourself not as a human being.
You talk to one person today and the next day you hear that that person is dead.
What does one do in this situation? You just feel this inadequacy. You feel sick with this feeling of inadequacy. So my journalism did expose me to developments which made me feel that I just had to become part of this thing. And the big problem was, what could I do which would be most effective?
I didn't go on with a normal life because a normal life wouldn't have been possible. I think to a lot of people, there was almost a revolutionary transformation in each one of them. You began to be much more critical, much more focused because I wanted to do something. And the most common thing to do at that time was to leave the country. We gathered at the house at about 6 early evening. And then we sat there, waited for transport. We were very quiet. I mean, if you know that you're going to be leaving at 9 and you're leaving forever, something must happen in you. The rule was that you don't tell anybody, you don't tell your family when you're leaving, they don't see you leaving, etc. Then I had to agonize with this thing the whole day. And I broke the first rule. On the first day, I went to tell my grandmother. I just told her that, Ma, I'm leaving. And I was crying at that time. I was crying real, that I am leaving. And what she does, she gives me 20 cents for my journey. She didn't have money, and all she had on her was the 20 cents piece, and she gave me that. Then I went back to the bedroom, took the bag, and I kissed her and I left. Then there was a driving through the night. The 12 of us in that car. There was no food, there was nothing. We didn't stop at any point. We didn't know the crossing point. We didn't know who was going to receive us. Nothing.
Johannesburg, 1978. My time with Jenny and Howard at 60 Becker Street. I can't remember us ever having discussed the question of direct involvement in the resistance struggle. It's strange that it didn't occur to me back then that they might be considering joining the underground. After all, they spoke of nothing else, but what could one do?
We see around us a political system which is legislatively brutal to a group of people purely on the basis of the colour of their skin. And we as whites are the beneficiaries of this in some material senses. And there's a tremendous feeling of guilt.
I can't engage like that. I can't engage because I'm feeling guilty. Someone's making me feel guilty and I must go out and get arrested. If I'm going to engage, it's from a basis of serious objection on moral grounds, not on grounds of guilt.
Howard had refused to do military service, one of the first whites to do so on political rather than religious grounds. The consequences had been traumatic for him. I could see that.
These people had hurt me very badly, and I could see them hurting other people very badly, and I hated them for it, and I wanted to get rid of them.
So Howard went to see Hani, came back from Lesotho. Hani had asked whether we would get involved in propaganda and other underground activity on behalf of the ANC, and Howard didn't want to do it unless I was involved. So he said, would I do it? So I said, how many years in prison did the last person get for doing this kind of activity? And I think it was about 10 years in prison. So I said, I thought that was a lot of time in prison for an organisation I knew absolutely nothing about. So we said no. That was the first contact with the ANC. It was initially a no, that he would not work for them.
At that time, Jenny and I never mentioned the ANC at all. The all-pervasive fear was infectious. Only in a letter from Harare, Zimbabwe, where she and Howard had moved in 1981, did she tell me of having made contact with the ANC for the first time.
Did it feel scary? I'm trying to remember. I don't think particularly. It felt like you needed to be careful. But I wasn't really doing anything but meeting. And I think it felt exciting more than scary, because this was like going for the forbidden fruit. And it's like, so it's got that appeal to it.
I knew that I was being drawn inexorably in that direction, that was where I was going to go.
The next hurdle was mustering up the courage to go and say, I want to join. Because it's very hidden. You meet odd people and then you would think, what am I supposed to do in order to join this organisation? Because it's got a lot of mystery around it.
I think part of my fear probably was, would I be well enough prepared in my mind for the step that I knew I was going to take?
It just felt that this had to be done. This was the right thing to do.
We arrived at about 6. That was at night. the tents all over, the dim lights in the tents, the lanterns. So, you immediately knew that you've arrived where you've been going. There are a lot of things to learn at such places, lots. And the biggest one of them all is self-discipline.
From being a very angry man,
Sihle Mbongwa, commander in the underground army MK.
only interested in taking up the gun and shooting, probably without that broader understanding which I gained from the ANC, I could have merely picked up the AK, come inside the country and shoot whoever.
So you learn to get to grips with yourself and control your emotions, react much faster to situations, and also begin again to appreciate the next person next to you. After my first course, we were sent to Kashito and open up a new camp there. We had to build a camp from scratch. I didn't have a single skill except manpower. So I was never featured in any specialized area. I would be those that would cut, chop, carry the mules. I was very strong and I was very happy to carry. We had a very, very beautiful course. That's where I met with the Russian instructors. The course was conducted by Russian instructors. To ANC, they were very dear. To MK, even much more dearer, because that's where we got most of our specialized courses from. Very little or nothing ever came from the Western countries, almost nothing. So meeting the Red Devils was like meeting the White Angels for us.
It's a funny thing when you enter something like that, how you abdicate a lot of your own decisions and you hand them over to someone else. It's a very strange process that takes place at that point because you're very nervous. You don't know what the ANC is fully. No clue how it operated. No clue how they decided whether someone did something or not, and would find it quite difficult when people in the ANC would say, what do you want done? Because I always thought that they would know what needed to be done. I discovered later, of course, often people didn't know what needed to be done, and that's why you ended up getting this question all the time.
My experience of the ANC, and I think this is a very common experience, is that we used to spend at least 80% of our energy trying to overcome frustrations and difficulties in the ANC in order to spend 20% of our energy fighting the enemy. That's the ratio.
It was extraordinary how little support or input or conveyance of knowledge or training was then given. In fact, basically nothing. I ended up defining exactly what I thought needed to be done because we were getting no input at all from the ANC side.
Even the decision to return to Johannesburg to gather clandestine information there was made by Jenny alone.
Everything revolved around legends. What legend did you have? Why was I leaving him behind? Why was I coming back to South Africa? That was an extraordinary experience because you're going for the first time as a different person. I left as an ordinary South African. Now I'm going in fully illegal. You're going in to conduct a legal activity. So that you just feel different. You cross that border like you're another person.
From any country that bordered with South Africa into South Africa, crossing is not an easy matter. Usually, as you cross along the borders, tension comes, no matter who you are. If it didn't come, we are not real.
Jacob Zuma, at that time chief of ANC intelligence, Kevin and Jenny's superior in the underground.
So you did feel that the situation is tense. And how do you deal with it?
You're talking of a group of human beings here that are being sent on what could be a one-way type of a trip. And all of them are thinking of that. All of them know the reality that I might come back and I might not come back. The first time when I experienced all those funny nightmares, when you dream or you're trying to cross the border and all of your shirt gets caught in the barbed wire and you can't release yourself, and you can see these people getting closer and closer, and your comrades are getting further and further. Those type of things. But the most unfortunate part, we never had a situation that allowed for people to begin to talk about how they feel. Somehow everybody avoided that subject. And I think people were pressurized by the fact that I've decided to join the army. I can't afford to say I am scared.
May 1984. Kevin's route back to his country for the first time. Now as an underground unit commander responsible for ANC intelligence in Natal. He'd learned in his 7-year absence how to handle weapons and explosives, how to gather intelligence, organize resistance, and convey the ANC's political goals. But there was one thing the training failed to teach the cadres: how to survive, day for day, in enemy territory, with practically no money and often without logistical support.
You look at the type of training, you look at the type of preparation that person received just before he went into the country, and you feel that this was murder.
What awaited Kevin? 27,000 soldiers on South Africa's borders, operating roadblocks, deployed to fend off incursions by ANC cadres. That is, people like him.
I walked to the station, and most unfortunately, I went to a ticket office, and there was a white man there selling. Ordered a ticket to Durban in English, and this fellow responded in Afrikaans, and I just couldn't make out what he was saying. And he was not in a very, very friendly way. In fact, the very opposite. And I just couldn't understand what exactly I'd done wrong. And as I was moving away from the window, I then realized that on top there it was written whites only. And I actually nearly kicked myself for being so stupid. I then went to a much more African type of a window that would say, here you can buy your ticket, and I got the ticket. But really, I was not expecting that early. And it was like a shocking welcome back home, that things are like this here, and this is how you have to act. And even on getting onto the train, you have to check the whites only, the water. I think it was a very good welcome for me. But again, a funny feeling in me. It's a feeling where anything could happen, and we are sort of ready for it. You could get there, you could not get there, but you're quite clear and your mind is made up.
Pietermaritzburg railway station. Kevin arrived in a strange city in which he knew nobody. Tired, churned up, utterly dependent on the unknown contact who was to collect him. Dependent on meeting this contact according to plan, to the minute. But it did not go according to plan. The nightmares of the last nights threatened to become reality.
The agreement was that when I jump out of the train, he would be there waiting for me. And unfortunately, that didn't happen.
So when he came, he sat there, and he said and said and said.
Zwelim Kiese, doctor, worked together with Kevin in the underground.
1 hour went past, 2 hours went past, 3 hours went past, and there was no me.
One strong principle of underground work is that when you've gone to a meeting, the maximum time you spend waiting is 10 minutes. If the person doesn't turn up within 10 minutes, you have to move.
So he looked around and said to himself, look, I'm in trouble. I'm now going to be caught. 3 hours I'm sitting here. I don't know what mobilization is going on. This fellow is not here. I must move.
Where would I have gone to if I decided to move? I had no choice but to wait.
So he hasn't got a choice but to sit.
I think it was one of my longest of waits ever in life.
When I come into the place,
I immediately recognized him as a person to be picking me up.
I looked around and I looked at eyes which are interested in me.
But my reaction was like, take your time.
And then I see there's some young fellow sitting there with a smallish face and very dark, and so, but he's wearing a jacket, black one. Oh, he wasn't supposed to wear it, so I went past.
I allowed him to walk down the platform, and I stood up so that when he comes back, we then can have an encounter.
So was he relieved, the fellow?
At last they could leave the station. Nothing happened. They were not arrested. Everything seemed normal. It seemed as if the panic which had overcome Kevin while waiting had been completely unfounded. But was it unfounded? What lay in wait for him?
We had already calculated, particularly around 1985, that the lifespan of a guerrilla here was 6 months. That if you get in a machinery, it gets blasted within 4 to 6 months. And it was a matter of when it's going to happen.
Operating inside was extremely stressful. And watching every move. And you're on enemy territory, so to speak. It's not that you're removed from it. You're operating right where they're everywhere. And so that seemed to be more need to be really so vigilant. It's always a problem of going to see somebody and that I bring danger to them. I think like for the first time I went back to see Beyers. He was one I thought should know, and then he could make up his mind whether he wanted to associate. He was the one person I told. You do need some sense of support from somebody so that you're not entirely alone. And I think that's important. There's somebody there that you absolutely trust.
That was the time.
Beyers Naudé, church leader in resistance to apartheid.
When I deliberately set aside also time to listen, especially to young blacks, of what was happening, of them telling me also of what they went through. And that was, to me, it was an absolute eye-opener.
So Beyers had such a wide network of people that I could say to him, what do you think of so-and-so? How do you feel about them? And he would know, he knew everybody.
You know, they came and shared with me part of their problems, their difficulties, the question, for instance, especially of young people leaving the country, needing money to leave the country.
Remember, he was banned. So you were always guaranteed that you would be seen going to Beyers' house.
I said to her, Jenny, you know, the easiest thing to do is if you could come to Emerensha Dam and then we just walk. Because then we can see if anybody else is following us. And in any case, it's not possible for people to overhear then.
And we never made it a regular time or a regular day of the week or anything. One thing important in underground is make nothing regular. Everything, you're constantly making sure that there's no pattern to your life. And the only pattern to your life is the one that you might want them to monitor. For the rest, you cut out any pattern. We collected on military personnel, different people. The military camp up the road from here on Eastgate. We would park on one side of the base, walk all the way to Eastgate, that was a couple of kilometres away, and come back the other way around and come to the car. But I mean, it definitely looked suspicious if anybody was following. So that's when it was very important to do the check routes and make sure we were not followed. There was a whole layout you wanted to get to know. You could only do it by walking around very slowly and very often, over months, till I knew its scale, its size, its movement, its personnel numbers, all sorts of things, just from observation. It carried a heavy responsibility. If you monitor people's movements, you've got them down to the last, how they move, come and go, so that they are very vulnerable. If MK had been more efficient, I mean, there would have probably been much more direct consequences to what we had provided them on information in terms of deaths. Where it got much closer was in the 90s, and then there was a choice. Is this person killed or not?
The Eastgate military garrison, which Jenny had reconnoitred, was not to become a target of the underground army. But the attacks on police stations, electricity plants and overground power lines increased. Acts of terror committed by terrorists, as they were officially reported. It occurs to me how suggestive this language is. Terror. The message this word conveys haunts my mind too. Over 100 terrorists involved in 42 acts of terror were either arrested or eliminated. That was the end-of-year resume in the words of the security police.
Once I'd been in for 6 months or so, the ANC then outside said, we would like you to send out young people for training. And that's when I nearly had heart failure. I said, you want me to go and meet a whole lot of young people and send them out to you, and then they come back inside the country again and organise all of that. And I said, it's very, very risky.
Everybody was afraid of that, that if I take this particular person into confidence, I might, sacrifice my life.
Jenny came to our offices, to the offices of the union, and then asked for me.
Rita Nzanga, trade union leader, with Jenny in the same underground unit.
Then she came to me and spoke to me and said she's been sent by the movement to come to me.
I approached Rita on the advice of Bayers.
A white girl, and such a beautiful girl. I can see that she had all, now there's a sound of, she had all, her future in front of her, and I could see she was brilliant, and you could see that she was from a well-to-do family, and I became a bit suspicious of her.
Someone would come with such story, and yet he's an informer in order to come and trap you.
So I went to meet Bayers Nodie, and I asked him, Bayers said, work with her, support her, do everything with her, she's okay. She's been sent to come and help you.
No, this is a very dangerous game. It's very dangerous, no doubt about it. How can she, if she is picked, I even pictured her. If she can be picked, the security will mess her up. 1, 2, 3 days, she'll be a mess.
But at the end of the day, we ran some very efficient and excellent units. I mean, Peter, we set up a cross-border line so we could move people illegally across the borders. He would pick up the people. He would then have a legend all the way through the journey. It would change. And he would give them soccer shirts or different sports things and that sort of stuff. He never spoke to them. All he would say to them is, we're going to head for this town. If we stopped at a roadblock, we're part of a soccer team and we're going to play soccer in this town. Once they passed that town, he'd give them the next legend for the next town until they got to the border and the old man. And then they would have the contact.
If it backfires, it comes straight to your head. It knocks you off. And that is 20 years in Robben Island, that's for sure. if you can survive the torture. Sometimes, we made some arrangement, to meet. And you'll find that maybe I am late.
For him, it was not a crisis if you were half an hour late. For me, it was absolute crisis if you're sitting in a strange area and you're feeling fairly vulnerable to put up with that lateness. Everything should work much more to clockwork.
Her problem was that now she wants things to be chop.
I found it very difficult. I think we came from very different generations. We had a very different concept of how you organize and manage something.
First of all, you've got to consider the village men at the border. You've got to consider the transport. Maybe our transport, breaks down, and the whole network, collapses. You are correct to say, she's from another background, and I, a man on the ground, I've got to consider all this. Because really our problem was the communication between the external forces and the internal forces. We didn't have a good communication. And now Jeannie brought in something where you can write a letter with numbers, and send it, that was very good.
I also concealed in special cards these negatives. You'd split the cards and stick them down. I mean, I was an absolute past master. I would literally, the amount of hours I spent on this.
Very good. It was a fantastic, That's why I said after she came in, there was improvement in communication, in work.
Control was a big issue. That's what Underground was about. It was always trying to control one's environment, saying, I'm going to put myself into a risky position. Now I'm going to build up a whole series of controls to minimize that risk. And one of the most difficult things is you get worried that they bug your house. It's when they intrude on your personal life. So if you're having sex, every argument with your husband, every intimacy can be recorded. And that's the thing that is most bothersome. And there'd been quite a few indications of being watched at the time, and there were guys planted on corners and that sort of thing. And I remember just lying in bed and just crying and crying and crying, not wanting to go out. So it never, ever leaves you. This consciousness that you're being possibly watched. Every movement and action, I think, feels very self-conscious. It was always aware of who was around me. I was always looking at that. Who was close by? What did they look like? What were they doing? Always conscious of that. It gets less and less natural because you're living another life, and you've got to perform in a particular way.
Lying became second nature as a result of that. I mean, if ever I found myself telling the truth, I'd get a terrible fright and think, what have I given away?
You'd never share that agenda with anybody else. So there's this big secret that governs everything you do, the whole way you behave.
I remember really needing her for reasons that I don't want to go into. But and she said I would have to leave.
No, we couldn't have her. We did all our underground work in the house. The photography was done. Everything was concealed and hidden in special places. And it was too tense. We were a young married couple in a very, very difficult circumstances. I said to Howard, I can't have her. It's just impossible. We cannot exist like this.
In political process, particularly in the revolutionary process, clandestine process, all relationships, all people, all things are instrumentalized to the cause. And that is the big problem. It's the big dehumanizing, desensitizing problem.
The one issue that really struck me once was in the park in Yeovil. And we were sitting in the park, and it was still the days of the pass laws. So if you didn't have a pass on you, you'd get arrested. And a pass law van drove up into the park, and they started grabbing people and throwing them into the van, the police. And this one person was resisting with all their might. I've never ever heard such screams and cries and despair in my life. And Howard and I both just sat there, and we said, you know, we can't go into that situation, and we just watched it. And I think that was the one time I resented the underground work, that I couldn't respond spontaneously to a very incredibly unjust system. And the doubt I have now, was it worth just sitting there? Because when I look back, I just wondered what I ever achieved in the ANC, and sometimes the human response can achieve more.
Natal, 1984. After 7 years' absence, Kevin is finally back in his country, but he is still not at home. Illegal, with a false passport, officially he does not exist. Very alone, always on his guard. He has contact only with a few comrades who work in the underground as he does.
It's a feeling of extreme loneliness. Extreme loneliness in a big pot full of people.
At first, Zweli puts him up in a room at Edendale Hospital. But Zweli himself is away all day working as a doctor.
I didn't meet with anybody. They hardly ever saw me in the township, or saw me at all. People had no clue in terms of who I was. They just took me as one of the activists.
It's during that time that, you know, I got involved with Kevin.
Sifiso Kuneni, a youth from the township of Chesterville.
You know, I didn't know him as Kevin then. I knew him as Tiger. That's the name he was going under then.
He was one of the most wonderful operators underground.
Very secretive, you may even say a bit withdrawn.
I sent him into the country many times. He's one fellow I knew I sent him will come. And even when we suspected there was some danger in our structures, we were able to coordinate with him to avoid the danger.
But it was almost impossible to avoid the danger. For what Kevin had kept to himself, he is convinced that the Swaziland-based ANC commander responsible for underground operations in Natal is an agent of the regime. And that means that Kevin stands between two fronts. He must prevent the security police from discovering his identity and also avoid betrayal from within his own camp. He cannot even share his suspicions with his comrades without jeopardizing their fighting morale. He only hints at what exactly his work entailed. It remains obscure. To us, he seems to be the man behind the scenes, who plans, advises, coordinates, and organizes. He seldom talks of concrete campaigns.
Propaganda work is very risky, very, very dangerous. A duplicating machine is very noisy. It goes kusho, 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 and you'd need to have a person there.
I had been given the task of recruiting, you know, a person from each township now, you know, to distribute those pamphlets, and I did. It was all over Durban, you know, in a matter of 24 hours now. And those are things that must have astounded, you know, the security police.
Did you also have a code name?
Why should I say that to you? Yes, I did.
But you wouldn't like to reveal that name?
No. In my mind, there are two compartments. One for things I can discuss with anybody. One for things I discuss only with a select few. You know, my mind has been conditioned like that by my involvement in the struggle.
You tend to live dual lives, and you got to make sure that the two don't mix.
It creates a very, very big conflict in you, where you can see a person moving towards you, and you know that the person is moving towards a very, very big lie. No matter how much that person would try to probe you, you have this wall. You know that this person can penetrate to this level and nothing more. It gets to be very, very scary when people get to be very close to you. Where the fear begins to be, what if they discover who I really am?
It's not always easy, you know, but you learn to live like that because your survival depends on it. Your very life, you know, depends on it.
Sifiso Kuneni. To us, he is, in a certain sense, Kevin's alter ego, a boy who'd grown up in post-Soweto times, the time of especially harsh repression at the beginning of the 1980s.
The final straw came after the murder of my brother. You know, it's then that I moved irrevocably towards the ANC camp. It was in March 1986. They continued to send threats that tell that Sifiso that we would get him. You know, and this time we're going to kill him. I was in the township, though not at home, one morning when my sister came to tell me, look, Polly is dead. He had been killed by members of the A team who had attacked my home the night before. I went home. His body was still there, you know, the corpse, lying just outside that small room where he used to sleep, with 4 bullets in the chest, and he was cold, you know, and dead. Yeah, and that was it.
Do you know who really did it?
Yeah, I know.
They are still in the township?
Yeah, they are.
Can you a little bit describe the situation of the A-team at that time? Did they terrorize the whole of the community?
Yeah, they did. They did, and they had the support of the police, you know. That is why they were a law unto themselves, just like the police now, who could kill people and get away with it. I was the only activist in the family, and my brother went. And his 2 children are alive and they're growing up. That sense of guilt was always there. But it's a price that had to be paid anyway. You know, somebody had to do what we did. And the underground is what gave respect to people who otherwise lived in a society where they were not accorded any respect. It was inevitable that we should have done something to defend ourselves. And the only people we could look up to support us in that, and with the not only the know-how, but also the necessary equipment, were the ANC.
Their hopes were very high, and this was one step that was supposed to be taken logically, and they had to have the guns.
To provide people with the kind of skills that enabled them, you know, to affirm their humanity, you know, in the face of attacks, you know, by people who had absolutely no regard for them.
Angela comes across letters from her great-grandfather, who'd come from England to South Africa in the 19th century, and who, as one of Durban's founding fathers, is still to be seen in the Museum of Local History. These letters shock us. We feel uneasy, and we ask ourselves whether simply being born in another place at another time has saved us from similar attitudes. Durban, March the 9th, 1867. War has broken out again between the Dutch and the Kaffirs. I hope we won't get drawn into it. It sounds a hard and cruel thing to say, but it seems the only thing to be done with such savages is to kill them all if possible, and so put an end to all future wars. If I should be personally called to take part in it, I should try to destroy all I could. It's dreadful to think of sending so many unprepared souls thus to eternity, but the safety of the whole white population depends upon their being taught a lesson. 120 years later, Sifiso writes in his diary, "Add phosphorus and close the lid. Choose the place of detonation, remove the lid, ignite the fuse. Walk away calmly and normally. At the time of the explosion, you will be safe and sound." And directly beside it, "To my beloved one, may your days be filled with joy. May your name always mean happiness. May you never cease loving me faithfully. May the love that I give you suffice until your cup of desire overflows with fulfillment. My darling, I seal this envelope with tears of loneliness and with eternal love until we meet again. I love you, Sifiso."
I was moving around all the time. Never had time to be with her, and never had time to build a solid relationship with her. I only had time to build a solid relationship with the underground.
For Kevin, it should be easier and is actually more difficult. The woman he loves, whom he marries, Kosi, is an underground cadre like him, but she is stationed far away beyond the border. It's like the old classic story. They could not come one to another. Kevin cannot even send the letters he writes her night after night. Security rules forbid it.
They would have really been quite a wonderful couple, But this is life, so you take what you have. You don't start wishing for what you don't have.
The marriage in me meant a lot. It was a marriage that was part and parcel of me, my growing up, my work, my everything. It's like I'm looking at a flood, taking whatever that had made me, that is responsible for me, that is part and parcel of me completely, and hopelessly looking at it being washed away, and I felt very empty. The structure began to crumble.
We recognized that, there was serious trouble coming.
One of the key people in the structure died from a grenade blast.
Tula, whose death at first was a mystery, a close friend of Sifiso's. In one of the group's attacks on an armored vehicle, he was torn to pieces by the very grenade he was detonating, and nobody knew what had really happened.
That was the time that we began to suspect that there was something terribly wrong with these weapons.
It took us a while, but part of the eye-opening came from Kevin to me.
The commander, one of the key commanders from outside that was servicing the military structure, was actually later proven to be an enemy agent.
Some of the commanders were working for the wrong side. And they were working for the wrong side completely. They were working with the Boers, with the South African regime as agents.
To talk with Tula's family. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to go to a mother and explain the circumstances under which, her son died.
We can never know the true extent of casualties that this struggle has produced. What we have not spoken about are those who have got psychological trauma out of the process. We have got those who have lost wives, who have lost husbands, those whose marriages broke up. We've got those who have gone on to suicide. We've got those, it's a whole range. And there's no way you can ever calculate that and know what it cost.
Because of the rapid development of the structure on the military side, something happened.
So it was a terrible bomb blast that really had serious consequences. And therefore the police activity went and raided almost all the units which were in that area.
Which then collapsed the military structure altogether.
That was December 16. Then we had a few days, literally, to survive. A lot of neighbors had woken up, the dogs screaming. There were about 30 cars, quite a number of Caspers. I could identify 7 or 9 just around the house and so forth, which was a big fanfare.
Banging on the doors, the wall, and, with dogs barking and, torches all over the place. Then they said, open up.
In the first instance, I was escorted. Then all of a sudden, the guards next to me were moving out of me so that I walked there alone. Then I felt that, the aim is to shoot. I was just waiting for the sound. Then I was thrown into that car, then moved to CR Swart police station for interrogation.
I was put under Section 29. No lawyer, no reading material, no visits from your family, and solitary confinement. I used to play with the ants, that used to run through the cell. So they kept me company there. And, I had even given them names, Yes, I would build a circle, confine them, into this circle, build, a circle using Vaseline, That's it. So they'll be confined there. We would play, I'll chase them around the cell. Those are the things that, kept one sane-minded.
I looked at the newspaper. I got shocked. Yes.
They actually, in the front page article, indicated that they were looking for a professional man in Maritzburg, which meant Zweli.
Terrible. It was terrible. I knew I was going to exile and I would not come back. I'll never find this old lady back alive. But I can't tell her I'm going. And if I tell her, she's going to be devastated. Now, what do I say to her? How do you say bye-bye to somebody and you might never see her? So when I was out there, as I was taking the car, and the kids were excited and, screaming, hey, bye-bye. And then reached for my wallet, and there had lots of coins, you see. So I said to them, no, go and give through the old lady and tell her this she would use for her offerings in the church. And then I drove off.
Like an ominous footnote to an escape which itself succeeded, the man who had organized the flight was arrested 2 days later. Kevin, for whom this man is the immediate contact, finds himself within range of the police for the first time.
I could be picked up at any moment. That never come this close to myself.
Pat's Kitchen, an inn right next door to a police station. A strange choice of refuge, a risky one for someone on the run.
There's a basic reasoning here. is that they wouldn't look for you at their doorstep. Rather, they'd go into the township to look for you. And I booked there for a week, and I stayed with Kose. In the evening, I would go into the bar and have a drink with the cops.
Like being on the razor's edge is how he described the feeling. And this feeling remained with him until he left his refuge and headed for Durban to disappear underground.
It was looking messy. It was looking like we didn't have much time. And I was called out.
And I think we both began to feel that we were under surveillance.
Howard phoned in an absolute panic. He was being followed. His father had phoned him in crisis. His father said, he just phoned him and said, get her out, they're going to pick her up.
Jenny quickly ducked underground, disappeared.
I then met my unit people.
It was really the most difficult moment in my life, knowing very well that really I'm going to be picked, no doubt about it. And where does this lead? Whether it's jail or whether it's what, I don't know. But now, I think, if I still remember where, she said, how about, going outside the country? No, I dismissed that.
Why?
Yeah, I said no. You can't all go outside the country. There must be other comrades within the country who will now carry other part of the pillars of the struggle. I said no, I will remain out inside the country.
It must have been about 4 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning. The car broke down outside Pretoria. It was really weird. And I found myself in Marabastad, which is at old Pretoria Township. In a sense, it's one of the last images of South Africa, which was having an image of having entered a township. Stuck there, seeking help, getting help, and then leaving.
Berlin, 1986. I'd heard nothing from Jenny for a whole year, and I couldn't find her when I was in South Africa in April 86. Nobody had any news of her. She'd vanished without a trace. I didn't know that exactly at that time she was in Berlin, in my city, close by, and yet far away from me, a few miles further east on the other side of the wall. There for 6 months of training in military intelligence, trained by state security officials of the GDR in East Berlin. Almost 10 years later, in 1995, we accompanied Jenny through a Berlin without a wall. For the first time, she takes the train from east to west, passing the famous Reichstag, recently wrapped by Christo. For us, like a symbol of the sphere of memory, where history can be reflected upon, including that which lies behind Jenny.
There was ambivalence around the GDR and the sense one had of this society about the fact that people can't cross borders freely. But it was not my problem. It was not my concern at all. My concern was to learn to be better equipped to fight the South African regime. It's very strange when you come back to where you trained and where your allies are and everything is just derelict. It's a bit frightening, it's a bit of a shock. Because this is what represented our source of strength. What was seen to be the strength and power of East Germany, and it's completely gone. There's nothing, it's deserted. So it is a very strange feeling, because this almost says, well, how strong was that base we stepped from? What foundation did we really establish? The fact that we chose a secret, hidden way to fight in order to achieve an open, free life has a contradiction, and that as an organisation, the ANC now has to deal with that contradiction as well, because it's used to it built up a culture that was hidden, and it's got to start unravelling that culture and start coming out into the open, and it's done that. It's done that to some degree. And I think part of your question is also saying, I mean, were we right to go for an armed struggle? Were we right to go for an underground struggle to oppose the South African regime? We did. I'm not sure it was the only choice, because I think what we were taught was that there was no other choice. It was a very constrained armed struggle. There's probably never been one conducted for so long in such a constrained manner.
Why did you have to learn to shoot?
Well, obviously, if you were going to be sent inside, and look at all the cartridges, the empty cartridges. No. These are from AKs. So the shooting was helpful because we could get killed any time.
Did this military experience change you as a person?
I don't know. You might need to ask someone else. I think I don't know. Maybe one hardens a little bit. That it brings you closer to dealing much more directly with the violence and death. The world was seen in such extreme forms. Everything was black or white. There were very few shades of grey. So the enemy's the enemy, and the good are the good. And that's it. What struck me so much coming out was that judgment and categorization of people is probably one of the least humanistic features one can find in life. In a sense, although we were fighting for humanistic goals, we were not in ourselves very humanistic. So I'm left with a lot of doubts around a struggle of this kind.
After 6 months of training, Jenny left Berlin. Her departure, as her arrival, went unnoticed by me.
When I came back from Berlin, I was immediately brought onto the command structure of intelligence and security for Zimbabwe as a region, running the units we did have inside the country, and how to find new units, how to recruit new people.
You're dealing with the whole spectrum of humanity there.
Phyllis Naidu, lawyer, leading ANC figure in exile.
It was very difficult. And then that humanity came from a criminalized country. I mean, where people who wanted a home had to beg, had to pay money on the quiet to get a home, you know? And if you didn't have a dom pass, if you couldn't get it, through the legal channels, you got it through the illegal channels. To get a job in the mines, you had to pay these fellas a whole lot of bribes before you can get it. I mean, this is ordinary living. And everybody was a criminal in that respect. And you take this now and make freedom fighters out of that. It's a very difficult struggle.
I think the problem was we were trying to almost make a mass-based underground. And that's very difficult.
So the ANC had a very difficult job to do in respect of its membership. And in fact, there are so many things we did wrong, but I think we have a very proud record of what we did do and do it right.
The concern in Harare was always individual assassination. Only the comrades on the command unit knew where I lived. So when you stayed in houses or were with people, you always made sure you knew a window where you'd loosen the burglar bars, that if there was any attack, you always looked where the escape route was. You make sure you sleep in really good solid pajamas, because if you run, you don't want to run in your knickers for some reason and go herring. But you'd think of those things. I mean, that's what I mean about that. Everything was self-conscious. It wasn't like you would strip and just go to sleep. It would be, God, I must always have pajamas and always be ready, and there was always a gun next to you, next to me, and that sort of stuff.
There's one situation, for instance, when I was in Swaziland, where they kidnapped one comrade, Mapumulo, next to the flat where I was in. It was the same block of flats.
Tsidi Mhlambo worked with Jenny in the underground in Zimbabwe.
Because I actually saw them taking him. He was bleeding, carrying him, forcing him to the back seat. I couldn't save him. I couldn't do anything. He died on the way. That's one memory I can never forget. Or sometimes I feel I can't even forgive myself for watching.
Look at all the people that died in front of us in Lesotho. I mean, that was the most traumatic thing for all of us.
If I had a gun, I would have shot those people, because I knew I was a sniper too in my training. So I always had that in mind, that if I were to find myself in that kind of situation, I would be in a position to kill the enemy.
They had to be met at that level, in other words, armed struggle.
Vonani Mufamadi, underground cadre under Jenny's command.
One couldn't hope merely to cause political problems for them. One had to fight them militarily. And so that was my vision. I felt that I was ready to be trained militarily and go back there and deal with those security police. There were in fact only a handful of them, 6, 7 of them, that were particularly notorious. And those were the ones that I felt I wanted to be trained, yes, to kill them. That's what I wanted to do.
Well, interestingly, one of my friends who was in that unit, I think what he admitted to me, the difference between intellectually wanting to meet this aim of the ANC and actually going out and doing it were chasms apart.
I don't at all feel, and I never did at the time, that there would have been one thing wrong with killing those people. Not at all. And I don't think that I would ever have had anything in my system, any conscience problems at all. I think I had got to a level with them where they were no longer people.
I don't think I could do it. I mean, I just look back and I don't think it was possible for me to do it. But we coexisted, we were co-responsible, we coexisted in an environment where some people did.
We had serious situations where we discovered enemy agents amongst ourselves, especially in the camps. There's a time when all of us were poisoned. Our food was poisoned by one of us. Now, such people, if you have to get information from them, you can't just get it from talking nicely to them. You have to use the same tactics that the enemy was using.
But that's one of the problems of such a struggle. You enter a struggle like this, you go into a very defensive situation, you're under enormous attack, particularly by the end of the 80s. The infiltration of South African agents was massive.
We are not sorry that we are part of the struggle, We shouldn't be apologetic about it. The things that happened had to happen. If people were to be tortured, they had to be tortured. Because, being in a guerrilla army, you are not like in a normal army.
You're in a very insecure environment. People are away from their home territory. They're scattered all over the world. They're under attack all the time. And so while your objective is to create a new vision, and that's out there as the process towards it almost drives you in the opposite direction, takes away an open and creative approach on life. I think these are the contradictions.
Well, there were people who were tortured by mistake because of wrong information. I feel sad for that, but as you know, in any struggle, innocent lives, people die innocently.
I don't know. As I told you, you sit on judgment today in a free South Africa, fruit juice in front of you, and you're judging people in a different circumstance. I can't do it. I can't do it.
We've just talked about in terms of comrades with very high moral principles relating to the society they want to create, seeking democracy, and then supporting torture. That's a huge contradiction.
It's very odd, you know. Whom are you going to free if you go on a campaign of, you know, torturing your own people, you know? Sometimes going to an extent whereby you eliminate them. It doesn't make any sense. Really doesn't make any sense to any normal person.
Much later, we read a letter which Jenny had written to her closest friend, where she writes about the darker side of the freedom struggle and of open questions to which she has no answer. What happens when the enemy's methods start to determine your own conduct? Or when, as Tsidi said, you can only save one person's life by torturing another? Does the end then justify the means? This old, terrible question, whereby, however you answer it, your innocence is irrevocably lost. Jenny writes of sadness and helplessness, and of a feeling of emptiness which engulfed her, of how it became more and more difficult to live with these contradictions, when her initial reasons for joining the struggle were sympathy, empathy, the longing to make things right, to make the world a better place. Then there was the Desmond issue, the point at which the contradiction between ideal and reality reached a crisis for Jenny. Desmond, one of Jenny's best underground cadres, whom she has to order to leave the country against his will, because the entire underground network around him was falling apart, and because his arrest might endanger the lives of others. Desmond, who disobeyed this order, and whose behavior was so at variance with the rules that when he finally did go to Harare, he was suspected of being an enemy agent, and was sent for years to an ANC penal camp.
The Desmond issue. It's one of the saddest stories of somebody where the ANC couldn't recognize the difference between someone who'd probably had one of the most fundamental nervous or psychological breakdowns, and instead looked at this person as an enemy agent because their behavior had changed so dramatically. And the ANC's responses to that were awful. There's no doubt about it. There's no excuse for the extremity of the response to his case.
A year after this interview, news reaches us that Desmond has died. Having returned home from detention camp, he was killed in a car accident. Too late for Jenny to speak to him. Too late for him to give testimony to the Truth Commission.
That's one which I would live with and never feel resolved about. I think that whole period was an emotional disaster. I mean, that in terms of the tension and anxiety, the dislocation I experienced from ordinary day society was enormous.
I remember Jenny taking me at the bus station to take the bus to the airport. I was going back to Lusaka. And her divorce had just come through.
Mohammed Timol, ANC intelligence operative in Zimbabwe.
And she told me that her divorce came through, and she was very emotional about it. But I couldn't respond to her. I just couldn't respond. Not that I didn't want to respond to her, but I could not feel sympathetic towards her. But these were the barriers that individuals put up.
One of the rules in the organization was don't mourn. Do you know what mourn means? Don't mourn, mobilize. And I thought it was a wonderful slogan. Absolutely. Don't mourn, mobilize. But when I lost my son in '89, and comrades were saying, don't mourn, mobilize, And suddenly I thought, this is rubbish, absolute rubbish, because if you need to do anything, you need to mourn, you know? You need to grieve. And how else do you deal with the pain?
But the times demanded that we do not allow ourselves to be emotional.
I just got burnt out. I mean, I just had it, where you get nausea and be sick all the time. You'd been doing for 8 years the same work, very intense, and all the workload kept doing was increasing and increasing and increasing. We were working some 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And the depression. The other feature was memory loss. You would undertake to do something and you wouldn't remember it 10 minutes later. I then went to the comrades and said, listen, I have to immediately stop the underground work because I'm a danger to people and I can't cope. And the response I got was, people just don't stop working because they're tired. I mean, I was so hurt that after 6 years of solidly working together with comrades, that even if they couldn't understand what had happened to me, that even if they didn't know what full burnout was.
It was purely a question of survival and maintaining your sanity at all times.
Even that, they could have given me the benefit of the doubt and said, we accept what you're saying is that you can't manage at the moment and you're sick and you need to stop. They didn't do that. It was very harsh. I was so eager to be kind of part of everything again because of that exclusion. Because it was challenging an entire way of living for the previous 10 years. That's your life, those are your relationships, those are the people you know. It's a huge break to get out of it if you wanted to. The unbanning of the ANC on, February the 8th was a complete shock.
In fact, in the ANC, I think I was the first one to know. One of the editors of a newspaper here phoned me at 8 o'clock in the morning and said, Phil, I'll be seeing you soon. So I said, when are you coming? He says, no, you'll be coming home. I said, what? So he says, Phil, de Klerk's speech I've got before me now, and it says that the ANC is going to be unbanned.
So I went rushing off to the Holiday Inn in Harare, and I saw Zuma just getting into the lift and dashed in after him and said, you won't believe this. I said, the ANC has been unbanned.
So I phoned the ANC in Lusaka, and I said to them, look, we're going to be unbanned. De Klerk's speech at 11 o'clock today is going to unban us. They said, shut up, fellas, you're just dreaming. Truly.
That night, we all got together and were drinking. And for the first time, comrades started talking about their past, where they might have lived in South Africa, how they felt about certain things. It was a bit like we all knew somehow that past now could come forward.
And I thought, this is our new South Africa, you know?
It was a moment, it was like a blip, where we all forgot about concealing our lives and who we were, etc. But then the next day it was like that night before hadn't existed. I was then sent back in by headquarters to follow Zuma, who was going in to prepare for the Grooteskuur talks. So it was the first talks that were going to take place between the ANC leadership, who were going to fly into the country, and the government.
To go to South Africa, this is after de Klerk's thing, wherein you will begin to discuss the issue of talks to remove the obstacles.
So I drove all the way through down to Gaborone and crossed first of all into Botswana. I was very nervous. There was no clearance for me to come in, no amnesty, nothing. You know, the whole point was it was very early days of negotiations. No one quite knew what the outcome would be. No one knew how much one could trust the government. And the rain was just coming down in sheets, and I could barely see. So that by the time I got into Johannesburg, it was about 10, 11 at night. I was absolutely wiped out.
I remember meeting Jenny when she accompanied Zuma to the first talks between the government and the ANC. We talked through the whole night. But what she didn't tell me was that the ANC had decided that despite the negotiation process, they would keep their fighting capacity ready for action until it became clear if the government could be trusted. What Jenny herself could not know at that time, the most dangerous phase of the struggle lay ahead of her.
I can't quite recall why Zuma thought it was so important that I worked with Kevin, but he decided that the two of us needed to pair up and that we were going to develop the underground, the ANC underground inside the country, with us operating from Johannesburg.
What was you actually feeling when you met this white lady?
Maybe the white lady is not so much a white lady in our situation. You don't see a person through the type of eyes. And I think there were other people around that were not necessarily attached to the unit. So there was always a type of a fallback type of situation in case the white lady gave problems.
No one expected this young white woman with such an innocent face would be doing what I was doing. So with Kevin, for example, we had to move a weapon into Soweto. So Kevin and I decided that we would be a young couple who would be going to a wedding in Soweto. So I dressed up in a beautiful summer frock, and he was dressed up, and he's nice and good looking in his shirt, a suit, and looking very snazzy. And we wrapped up the weapon in wedding paper and bows and little things, and lay it on the seat. So there was this nice long present on the seat. And we drove into Soweto, and as we were coming into Soweto, there was a major roadblock. And I must admit, I was really terrified when we were approaching this roadblock, because we've got really concrete evidence sitting on the back seat. Kevin and I drive up, and my heart was thumping until we hit the roadblock, and the policeman comes. I'm driving because Kevin couldn't drive. Comes to the driver's seat, looks at us, talks to Kevin and not me, and says to him, "Where are you going?" And he says it's a wedding, and basically then smiles at him and winks and says, "God, you're a lucky man, look after her," and says you can go on. And we looked so much the happy young couple, and that was the advantage that I could use as being a white. It was a very strange time. We were very isolated. You were in the country, it was a period of reform, and yet we didn't move with the normal society, we didn't connect with it.
Very briefly, our task was never very clear in terms of when and what to do.
It was much more that we were on our own. It was very difficult to get meetings with the leadership. The leadership were very busy dealing with negotiations. We couldn't get meetings, we couldn't get instructions, we couldn't get a sense of what they wanted. And I found that we started operating almost like our own little world, a little bit like a cocoon in this township, trying to decide what was right for the situation, without any reference to the broader political environment. We'd been sent into the townships to try and find out what was happening. The violence had broken out. The ANC believed that it was in Carter with security forces. We didn't really know what was happening. We were just knowing that suddenly whole communities were under massive attack by hostel dwellers, and that police seemed to be in collusion with them.
I remember Jenny once going with me to one of these hostels, these barrack-like men's lodgings in which migrant workers, mostly Zulus, lived far away from their families, as in ghettos, without contact to the local neighborhood. The seeds of conflict between them and the township people had been skillfully sown. On one side, mainly Zulu-speaking, rural, relatively uneducated workers, bound by tradition and brought up to obedience to the chief. On the other side, a mainly English-speaking urban population, critical and self-confident. Then there were the old ethnic tensions between Zulus and Xhosas, combined with the political power struggle between the mainly Zulu Inkatha party and the ANC. An explosive mixture to which the government deliberately lit the fuse, hoping to weaken the ANC in the impending elections. Later it was proved that the government, with help from security police with blackened faces, had planned and provoked fighting between the opposing groups.
Kevin and I then decided that we would go to Kusini Hostel as journalists and see if we couldn't start identifying who might be the leading figure in that hostel, and who would be the Inkatha figure who would be driving the violence. We went at about 6 in the evening, maybe 5 or 6. It was getting dark. The sun is going down. There's this courtyard, this very derelict hostel. There's lots of men there. There's a bar area, very drunk people, kids running around, and then at odd points these women with these white faces staring at us. And I think they were rather shocked that we'd walked in. And anyway, we asked to see the head of Inkatha in that hostel. And all the men, a whole crowd gathered around us. And Kevin was the interpreter. And the crowd, the mood would just shift and change from reason and then anger and shouting and screaming at us.
You can see a slow building of like a circle around you, and as you're talking to them, it's slowly moving closer and closer.
It was extremely volatile. We didn't actually know whether we were going to actually walk out of that hostel alive.
You wouldn't have been in a position to have defended yourself in any way. They would have done anything.
After that, I got a fright. I said to Kevin, we should never have done that. But it was like we would do anything. It was like there were no limits on the danger. It had gone to a point of being mad. Kevin and I were like two lone people out there, trying to find solutions.
Oh, it was terrible. Actually, most of the residents in the location, they ran away because of this Inkatha.
Edna Radu, a township dweller.
When these men come to attack us, before they come, you will hear the women cheering them up, that sort of a thing. We know that the Inkatha now is coming out.
It's late at night, very quiet here. Lights are off, it's dark, it's scary in the township. It's quiet. And from here, right inside here, when we are here, you hear this singing. That singing goes through you, and permitting that sound is the terror that comes with it. A very, very cold terror. You sweat. And when they sing, they cross the street, they come here, they sing. It paralyzes you completely. You can actually see the person shaking, changing in face. The gunshot outside, person changes completely.
You had no hope of living, not knowing what is the morrow carrying you.
Once the lights go down, it's you're at it again.
People were living through hell. And I think the mistake we made was thinking that we ourselves could fix that, take away that hell. And that when we couldn't, we just tried harder and we just moved to more extremes.
I've been in situations where I was completely surrounded alone, and unfortunately having a gun on me, you break out of that after being hit by sticks. You break away from them, you run 10 paces, you outrun them, you turn. As you're running, you pull out a gun, and then you turn and then you look at them. You don't shoot. I've saved a number of people from the other side. In that war situation, I would stand in between our own people from the township and whoever would be trapped from the other side. With a gun, if you take it out, point it at a person, you shoot, that's the end of a person. But where you take yourself as an example, you've got such a history, you've got parents, you've got so many dreams, there's so much that you're working on. You also transplant that into the next human being that you'll be looking at. And if you pull it and shoot at a person, that's the end of it, just like that. You learn to appreciate that there definitely would be more to it than this. There is more than you can do to save a situation than doing that. But to be part of a process where people die, it kills you even further. It dampens part of your sharpness towards appreciation what life is. But that serves to indicate that there is something that is dead in you already, somehow. You can't necessarily say, this is what is dead in me, but you die a little bit. Oh, I love this rain. I just love it. Really.
There was a lot of emotional desperation and
we all were finding it very, very difficult to cope there.
Because after months, if you're still getting no guidance and there's still no strategy and people are still being killed, the doubt about the movement and how it was managing that situation did set in.
The situation caught a lot of people unawares. There was no policy, no guidelines, no infrastructure, no approach, and therefore no answers from the leadership.
So in many ways we were self-appointed. You've become a bit like God's unto yourself. You know, you this. And I just doubted what we were doing was right.
It's like almost closing your eyes and walking into a situation.
And you kind of feel you're heading for some precipice. Anyway, we picked up information that there was going to be a big attack. So we went off to one of the ANC leadership. It was a Sunday night, 8 o'clock. So I went to his hotel in Johannesburg. And I told him that there was going to be, our information was there was going to be an attack. And he said no, he didn't really know what to do about this. But maybe he would phone Mandela. So there was a complete absence of ideas on what to do about this. They didn't seem to know how to deal with it. A few hours later, about 1 o'clock that night, massive attack with firearms, and they gunned down 22 of the men from Zumkazizwe, all dead, just left in the field. Afterwards, I went in. The streets were absolutely deserted, except for Caspers, the armoured vehicles of the police that were dotted around, and then the palls of smoke rising up into the sky as cars were burning along the street, and then the rudimentary roadblocks which had been set up by the hostel dwellers, and they would man the roadblocks as you drove down, and they had their rudimentary weapons and that sort of thing. And it looked like Mad Max. It looked like, you know, that we'd gone into a sort of crazy a craziness where people would just become killing machines, and that there was no sense of humanity left at all. That day had a profound effect on me. I couldn't see any point in what we were doing. I couldn't see that we were helping the situation at all. I felt that towards the end we were establishing a situation of banditry. And I realized that a lot of the people responsible for what I was looking at were our people. And we had trained up some of them. And they were no better than, in a sense, the IFP bandits anymore, because they were completely uncontrollable. The notion that you can just go and arm people and have self-defense units and that they will kind of protect the people, it became clear that that was nonsense. You can't just willy-nilly arm people and expect that you can manage that situation. And it resulted in me just reviewing completely my involvement in that violence and just pulling back, just thinking, we cannot engage in this. We had stopped having normal restraints on us. I don't know, it's like, I felt I'd become almost suicidal. I felt like a lemming. You know those animals, we just had to keep going and keep going and keep going, but we were killing ourselves. At some moment, I think I just paused and saw this, and just saw this image of being dangerous to myself. And yeah, I just got out. I just thought, this is enough. It took a long time to feel that I was getting out of the underground. Part of getting out of it was part of regaining something of myself. There was nothing left. The commander certainly wasn't there. That sense of having the purpose, the person fighting in a struggle or anything like that. And I think a lot of confusion, a lot of self-criticism, a huge emptiness, loneliness, but a sense that I needed to stay with that. And I think the overriding feeling was a sense of discovering myself again, that I'd lost any contact with myself. All the time I'd felt that I had died, that there was just always this dead feeling, until at some point it felt like there was a huge break. I remembered once just walking in the streets and the trees looked different. The sky had a different colour to it. Everything looked clearer. That's when I was convinced what I was doing was the correct thing. It was a sense that I was tapping, for the first time, my feelings again.
For Jenny, it was quite simple. Even if it was a very difficult decision for her to say, look, I can't cope.
I could get employment, which many ANC people didn't feel.
Myself, I'm supposed to be paid by the ANC, and I can't just say, look, people, I give up. Well, what would I have done after that?
But also, I didn't live in the townships. So I could actually get out of physical view from people, which in fact someone like Kevin could not get out of physical view.
And besides, I think I'd been in this situation much, much longer. My semi, not very healthy mental state was something which was quite normal to myself and acceptable. It was one of those very, very difficult moments in my life, but I had no choice. Like, I was part and parcel of it, and I had no form of escape.
April the 26th, 1994, the first democratic election in South Africa. After 4 years of negotiations between the regime and the liberation movement, Black South Africans decide for the first time who will govern them. The first whites arrived in the country in 1652. It took 350 years for the intruders and their descendants to agree to share the country with its indigenous people. Kevin went to Durban to vote, still carrying a forged passport in his pocket, and he voted under a name which is not his real one.
One thing which would have affected my emotions very serious was that I never expected to be here today. Well, given a chance, I've actually, this is very personal. I've actually organized some people that maybe we should buy some champagnes and they're ready to celebrate. Whether you're normal or not, I think you have a right to celebrate.
I feel optimistic from the point of view that at least it represents a firm break with the past, and you've got an opportunity to change the future. For myself, it has been better, and I hope, one can only hope that for the country it is as well, that if the society will look at itself critically, and I think that's very important, there is a potential to grow. It's when people want to block out self-analysis or criticism that I think we start losing something of what we struggled for. And that's what we've got to see. How much openness does come out after this election? How much do people feel that they can honestly talk about what they went through?
I, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa,
What did it cost to arrive at this moment? Such a long struggle. And even for those who are present today, so much life that was lost.
Having gone through the type of life that one has been, you'd say, if possible, if you had the means and whatever will left in you, you try to assist as much as possible to avoid anybody going through this type of a life. And I look at young people, the way they react to situations, the way they do things, and I think I wouldn't be bitter. But if given a choice, I think I would have loved to have gone through that.
When Kevin left school to join the struggle, he was the same age as these pupils now. Today, after 20 years in the underground, he is still without a completed education and without a real profession. The knowledge he gained was for a mission which is now part of the past. It didn't qualify him at all for the profession he loves. To work with young people as a proper career, not merely voluntarily, that is what he would have liked, he says. But how can he start all over again?
You still find a lot of the past coming in from time to time. You can't, I believe, without help, get rid of it completely. I've spent most of my time on my own, and that taught me quite a lot. And not only a will to survive, but an ability to survive on your own, completely alone. But then that would also make it very easy for a person like myself to disappear into self and shut himself out from the rest of the world. That happens very easily, where you can decide that you're not going to accept any calls, you're not going to call anybody, and actually think and hope that you survive, and actually maybe at times do. There are things that you'd consider to be the most normal in life that you would not have had an opportunity to have enjoyed, perhaps. Family, also in a position to go to people openly and not be worried about looking behind your back in terms of who is following you. Basically, is to perhaps wake up from this bed and come back to the very same bed, and it's something you learn to enjoy. So my movement from the abnormal to normal has been extremely, extremely slow, with no visible steps between the gaps, if there were any form of gaps, to perhaps the last stage when I resigned my last job.
And now you are above ground.
I'm not too sure of that. I'm not too sure of that. But I'm not active. I'm not doing anything serious, so I wouldn't say that. I'm not sure what it means being normal.
A business conference in France, which Jenny has organized. As an economics expert, she enables contacts between the South African government and business representatives. Her former underground comrades have become politicians, ministers in South Africa's parliament. And Thabo Mbeki, once her comrade in the struggle, is today president and is both guest and speaker at this conference.
I think it's a feeling of that we've become normal. What is so extraordinary for me is they're like two worlds. And if you're dealing with ministers and they're politicians, I suppose before there seemed to be more emotion, more passion, more innocence. It's different. People have moved on. The difficulty is whether you've moved away from certain principles or whether you have found a way of expressing those principles, but in another form. Now, you say, well, this is life. But are you saying, this is life and I can do nothing? Or are you saying, this is life and I can do something? And that's the dilemma.
What has the change meant to you personally?
It sounds dreadful, does it? But it's I suppose, in a sense, taking charge of my life. And part of taking charge of my life was adopting Mark. Because he was very much a choice about wanting a child and a family of my own. That I want him to explore as much as I explored. And I suppose that's the one issue where I feel that I haven't changed. I think I'm reconciled with the past. I think the past was very difficult. So I'm not saying it was easy, and I'm not saying I would go back into it from where I am today, would make a choice to go back into it. I'm not sure I would do that. It's more knowing myself and where I was, that was the right thing to do, but that I've moved on as well, and I'm happy I've moved on.
I don't think I have any form of regret where my participation is concerned. Not at all. Not at all. I think I've lost a lot through my work, through decisions that I've taken consciously. Not only the marriage part, I think there's a lot that happened. There's a lot that is still going to affect me for a long time. But I still think that it was the correct decision. I don't have any form of regret, except if you can ask me now, say, can you go back again? I would say, wait a minute, I need to think.
Seldom do we actually sit down and open ourselves up and look back. We're not always ready to do it.
I think it has been a long, long way, very long. We found the home. It is here, and it is for us to make it warm.
Not fulfillment yet. The feeling that I've got unfinished business. That's the feeling.
It's one of the almost fundamental flaws of a struggle, is that it doesn't prepare for the day after.
The terrain is different. It is very easy to actually get derailed.
The morality that drove the revolution is disappearing. That's what frightens me.
danger is that one does lose the drive to take things a step further.
I ask myself about the people who were throwing stones out in Soweto. They're still out there. They have to come back to beg for jobs, to beg for food, to beg for everything.
And hopefully we could have here in South Africa a society where we care about people, you know.
There are a number of times when one faces problems and then you sit down and say, well, listen, why don't I just get the hell out of this whole thing? And then you sit back and say, but you know, is that the right way of remembering those who have actually gone? Would it be fair, in fact, even to their own children, to say that this is why their parents died and today nobody bothers? And that's why I say the commitment has got to be stronger.